Welcome back to Basecamp Beta. Today with us we have Greg Zifcak, a phenomenal multimedia weirdo force in the world of the New York Underground. I am Sean.
And I'm Chris.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Greg, can you tell us just a little bit of overview of your general background? How you wound up getting into weird music, what your path to synthesis was, let's just talk basics.
Let's see. I played instruments as a kid a little bit. I played trumpet for a few years. And my parents told me I had to pick an instrument in the band at school, and I thought trumpet was the easiest because it had 3 buttons on it, and obviously that proved to not be the right choice for the amount of effort I wanted to put in. But so they let me stop playing it after a couple of years, and after that I didn't really have any. As a teenager, I didn't really know anyone in bands or anything like that. I did. The older brother of a friend of mine did have this all-ages club in Portland where I primarily grew up, called the X-Ray Cafe, and I went there once or twice, and I saw like punk bands and stuff like that. But aside from that, I really didn't have any kind of interaction with music, live music as a teen, or even, dance music or clubs or anything like that, except for, I guess, hearing stuff on the radio. So there was an AM radio station in Portland that played a lot of different kinds of stuff. It played a lot of 80s music. It played like indie rock, and it played some like synth pop from the 80s, which I had heard as a little kid, really was captivated by the sound of synthesizers in that music. And they actually also used to play a few rave tracks on that station. I was like, what are these? What is this? They'd play Messiah or Utah Saints or something like this. And I was like, I didn't know what it was. They also almost never said the name of anything. And I realized recently, I think that possibly hearing stuff primarily on the radio, separated from the personalities behind it, kind of... my focus on it was sort of like, what is making these sounds? I could tell that there was something that wasn't being played by hands, but I didn't think of like, who's doing this, or how can I find out who's making this or whatever. And I feel like when I hear music, I'm not like, what community did this come from, or what person is behind this, but like, how is that being done, mechanically almost. And then in high school, I guess I heard some electronic stuff, 9 Inch Nails, whatever made it onto the mainstream. And also I would hear Eurodance on the top 40 radio on Saturday night and be like, wow, this music is so high energy, and it has that like really electrical sound that I loved from new wave and everything like that. So ultimately, when I was 16, I visited New York to look at colleges, and my cousin was living here going to NYU and going to raves. And so she introduced me to a lot of stuff. She took me to Liquid Sky Store, and basically introduced me to Jungle. And then when I got back to Portland after that, I was kind of captivated by I knew that there was this sort of like hidden world of activity out there that there was not really penetrating the surface at all, And so I started like going out, and I started going to Goodwill and to like used record stores, and just finding there was a lot of great stuff in used record stores at that time, and even in thrift stores. I'd find Kraftwerk, obviously lots of 80s music and stuff like that, and it was all cheap. So I discovered a lot of stuff that way. And I also started trying to find events, and eventually got into sort of the club and rave scene in Portland from about 18, 19 or something like that. And then I went to a MIDI sequencing class at community college. So that was sort of how I got. Actually, before that, I bought a drum machine. I somehow found out what a drum machine was. It blows my mind how difficult it was to get information back then. And I was starting to get online, by the end of the 90s at school and stuff like that, and get onto forums, and I would see references to the Amen break, and there was like no media online for me at that point, really. And so it took me like probably a year before I even knew what that was, after being aware of it.
Before you were able to find like a real player sample.
Yeah. Oh, that's what that means. I didn't know if that just meant the standard 2-step drum and bass pattern, or what. But I think that the fact that it was so difficult to find things, it really drove me to like work hard to discover stuff, So I had this drum machine. I bought an SR16 from an hour away from Portland. Took the bus down there, and I had that for a year.
Is that the Alesis?
Yeah.
The
It's basically mostly acoustic sounds. There's a couple 808 sounds in there.
Famously still in production.
Wow. Really? Amazing.
Yeah, still in production.
I mean, I loved that thing. That's how I learned about sequencing any kind of pattern, That was the first time I had any access to that. And so For a year, I tried getting a Y cable from Radio Shack and plugging in a Casio keyboard at the same time into the amp, not knowing what a mixer was. So it was like, eventually, I took this this MIDI sequencing class at Portland Community College, and that was how I was like, oh, okay, this is how you get the whole thing working together.
Was that doing MIDI on the computer?
It was actually using MasterTracks, which was an old, I think it was cross-platform. I think we were using PCs in there, but I was talking to the lab guy and I was like, how can I do this at home? And he was like, well, if you can find an old Mac at Goodwill or whatever, I can give you this demo copy of the software and it'll probably work to set your computer clock back so that it works. And that did work. I was able to pick up a Mac Classic for like $20. And there I had MasterTracks. And so in a way, it was strange because this class, which was the late 90s studio MIDI paradigm, caused me to skip all the stuff that had happened throughout electronic music history up until that point. And there was no other way for me to really learn about it. Occasionally I'd buy dance music magazines and stuff like that, and I'd see this old gear, and I'd see that they weren't using computers, and I'd kind of wonder how all that worked and everything. Because in this lab, it was basically rack gear, a controller keyboard, and then a computer screen. And you're laying out blocks and cutting and pasting them and making these whole orchestrations. And it wasn't until a few years later, I think probably when I moved to San Francisco, I started picking up like some... I went to pawn shops and I started basically trying to build a MIDI studio at home. So I bought some old gear, mostly rack gear. I got an Akai S612 sampler that can sample for 1 second. It sounded amazing. I mean, I sold it at one point.
On that.
I bought it again because it's one of my favorites. Yeah, the filter is great. I mean, just the fact that everything's real time, But I got pretty deep into
the two sliders that you can mess with so that the samples play backwards and everything. It's
it's
a banger.
There's no menu, it's buttons, a 2-digit display for the MIDI channel or whatever, and then everything else is sliders and knobs. I also had a TX81Z and an effects unit. I had an Akai S20 sampler, and I started poking around in those. I had an Akai AX73 as the keyboard, which I didn't realize was analog at the time because the interface was so austere. It took me a long time to actually get into poking around through those menus. I ended up reading a book. I'm not sure. I might have just found it at the library, but it was called The Complete Guide to Synthesizers by Devarahi, just this one name. He went through and basically talked about how every synthesizer module works, and he had these beautiful hand-drawn diagrams of synth patches, like drawn out like schematics. And I sort of ate that up, and then eventually I was able to sort of dive deeper into the AX73 and stuff like that. And in this MIDI class, at one point they brought out this old Prophet 600. It had knobs on it, and as soon as I heard the filter, I was like, oh, that's what I want. And I was probably hearing tracks at that point where it was like probably Akai and Emu samplers where they were sequencing like a digital filter inside of it. But I heard the low pass filter and I asked the teacher, like, is there any way to just get the filter somewhere by itself? Like, that's what I need. And he was like, oh yeah, probably. But I think through that and through that book, I started to realize that there was a way to have a more direct interaction with the processes. And
so what years are we talking about here? Is this like,
I guess this would have been
96,
97, 98.
And what were you trying to make? Was it jungle? Was it like, what were you, was it
I was definitely making some jungle. I was also, I didn't, to me, everything was techno at that point. I didn't have any nomenclature,
Were you trying to make Rhythm of the Night or something? Your
Not quite.
Dance?
So let's see. What was I hearing? I had heard like techno, just had heard it by chance in places, and I think probably out of cars, here and there. And I had this idea of something that was kind of like industrial or Nine Inch Nails, but that was more stripped down and was cleaner. And I think of it without really understanding it or knowing who was involved or what the records were. There was a sort of sense of the sound that I was interested in, that as well as in jungle. And at this point I was going to clubs as well. So I was hearing how I actually had started working at a record store by that point and was going to clubs. So there was an older guy that worked in the electronic music section there who had been a DJ in the Midwest. And so he was trying to, fill me in on a lot of the history, and they had a few records there in that store, so I found some that at that point, probably too, I had read some magazines that sort of started to put it all together. I think Tresor was maybe the only techno label in that store, but there was a catalog of what we could order. So I just started ordering everything that was Tresor and buying those records. It was kind of like a mix of this like jungle influence through my cousin and with like, you know, the Jungle Sky label, which then I was picking up all the compilations, and then basically fast minimal techno that was on Tresor. And then as I would see DJs, there were certain ones like Stacy Poland came to Portland quite a bit. So I knew that what he played I really liked. So I started, you know, finding a little bit more out through that, I guess. So I'm sitting there with master tracks and this rack gear and stuff. And at that point, by the time I had that stuff all put together, I had an idea of what kind of, you know, what I wanted to make, I think.
I think it's worth just putting a little highlight on, even as late as like 97, 98, the kind of like boundaries between genres were not quite so fixed in terms of electronic music in America. If you were into one of those types of musics, they were all kind of the same thing: jungle, house, techno, even like harder stuff, gabber,
and then also even in like New York, like freestyle, like things that were kind of like seen as pop music more or less, like kind of radio music. I mean, that was still, you were still kind of into that, you know, if you were into house and jungle. If you were in New York, that all was kind of the same.
That might be more of an East Coast perspective.
I think so, yeah.
I do think, let's see. I mean, I definitely, as I met people in the club scene, I think they were into various kinds of things, but it was still definitely separate. Rooms were, you know, separate genres. But one room would go from one style to another, for instance. I mean, yeah, you'd have a DJ and then, you know, it would get harder as the night went on, whatever. I do remember feeling like when I got to New York and talked to people who had grown up here, that there was much more cross-pollination between kids that were hanging out in Manhattan were into metal, they were into punk rock, they went to raves, they were into hip-hop, all this stuff, whereas I didn't really feel that much cross-pollination in Portland for specific. I never went to rock shows, really. I guess maybe once or twice, but
what got you then into more like experimental kind of sounds? I mean, you seem to have had a interest in like noise and feedback from a bit of a early stage. How did you make that link?
Well, I was just remembering there was this guy in the MIDI sequencing class, and he probably was 27 or 28. He seemed ancient to me, you know, but we had some assignment to do something with a sampler. He had a sampler at home, and he brought in a recording of him sampling his dot matrix printer, and it just sounded insane, you know, just those sounds. And I was like, whoa, it like things like that broke the rules, I found really exciting. And he also, there was this other exercise in class where we had to do something with one unit. Maybe it was every group got a different unit or something like that. And we had this Yamaha SPX 90. And he was like, oh, the delay goes down to 1 millisecond. That's in the audio rate. Let's see what that does. And I was like, blown away by that. You know, just like over the years there have been various points where people have shown me that you could apply some kind of methodology that was outside of the way the instrument is designed, or the way that most people use it, or the way that, you know, just the tradition of how it's used or whatever. And I've always found that stuff really exciting. Then, you know, I ended up sampling some stuff with the sampler. Like I had this plastic license plate. I don't know where it came from, but I ended up making a whole track just by sampling sounds from that, pitching them up and down, finding that there were, I guess that really started to become a way of looking at things when I was in college in San Francisco. I went to San Francisco State, and I was in this department called Conceptual Information Arts, which was kind of this like mixed media, computery department that almost nobody at the school knew about, but it was run by this kind of computer pioneer, Stephen Wilson, who had been making art with a combination of like computer software and like bacteria or different, you know, biological experiments, whatever. And so that department, I feel like there was a lot of space to experiment. It was kind of, you know, just a probably mostly a standard new media program, you know, some critical theory, some Max MSP, sound art, those kinds of classes. And at this time, I remember I also feeling kind of annoyed by how a lot of people in that department or working with mixed media in a technological capacity would start very large. It'd be like, okay, I need this microcontroller so that I can take these sensors and I can get that into the computer and that can do this thing in Max. And I'm like, there's already a microphone input. I can just use some contact mics and those are the sensors. You know what I mean? Right. So, and for that piece, in fact, I was trying to make something strobe, and I was like, okay, well, I could use jitter inside of Max. How can I make it strobe with this video software? I'll just make one giant pixel that's the size of the screen. So for me, there's always been this like attempt to boil things all the way down to what can I use at a bare minimum, or how can I get the most out of this one small aspect.
And then what led you to Mills College? Is that roughly like right after this, or?
Not quite right after, no. So let's see. Actually, before SF State was San Francisco City College, which also had an electronic music lab that I spent a year and a half in or whatever, and they had a surge there that actually had been used by Patrick Cowley. So that was my first intro to modular
No idea
synthesis.
Patrick Cowley used a surge. That's great.
Yeah. I guess there's a Dark Entries record that has some early demos and stuff, and I guess there's some surge recordings that he made there on that machine.
We got to rethink this.
but,
like everyone's trying to make a surge pantheon, and we got to throw in some energy to that because
I really doubt the Surge is on any of his disco stuff, but
yeah, I'd be surprised. But I love that thing. I mean, so there in between here, actually, when I was still in Portland, I really wanted this filter so bad, and I couldn't get my hands on a filter anyway. So I found this Paya 9700 modular synth that was a kit that you had to build yourself. And so I learned how to solder basically to build that kit, and it was a failure. It just didn't work. The MIDI to CV converter worked. I didn't have any way to use that with anything yet, but basically then I shelved that. But through that process and through having read that book, once I got to the Surge at City College, I was like, okay, I'm ready to do this, And so I was making drum sounds on there. I was making sequences. They had a TKB. I just really took to it. And the fact that it was banana cables, I think I was just using all the patch cables. I was patching everything I could, And so from the beginning, that was like always such a huge benefit to me, being able to just split signal at any point.
Going back to your early experiments with Y cables, trying to shove things in where they don't belong,
And around the same time, I had really started to get deeper into modifying and repairing gear that I was buying. And one of the holy grails for me at that time was the 909 kick drum sound. And I was buying these Tama and Simmons modules from pawn shops and eBay, and trying to see if they could actually do what the 909 kick could do. And I was also on the Analog Heaven and Synth DIY mailing lists, and it was through conversations on there that I kind of came to understand that the 909 had two envelopes, unlike these modules. And so in asking questions, I was able to eventually add a second envelope to the Tama and get this really nice 909 emulation out of it. And, at a certain point, I ended up modularizing the Simmons so I could patch all kinds of different things on it. And, I went crazy with the 707, adding pitch controls to all the sounds and putting the 707 and 727 chips into one box. And I had also done some experimental circuit bending with it, making glitchy sounds, and also with kids' toys, like changing the clock rates and pitching things down and stuff like that. So I really started to get into the craft of electronic music, and once I got a hold of an actual 909, I modified that like crazy. A lot of the time that I was spending, I was actually working on the gear itself as well. And that's something that has stayed with me to the present. In the way I work is like to try to see the studio as one system that's all accessible in real time. And so the building of stuff and modifying and repairing and maintaining it is still like a key part of the work that I do. But to answer your question, so after SF State, then I was in a project called Eats Tapes, which toured quite a bit. We spent a few summers in Europe, even 4 or 5 months at a time, based in Berlin, and toured around the country a couple times. Twice in one summer, actually, which was crazy. But so I had quit my part-time bookkeeping job in San Francisco in order to tour. And so I got back from tour 1 year and started doing home theater installation. And I was actually working with Seth, and he was at Mills at the time. And so he was saying great things about it. And he the way he talked about it made me think, okay, maybe this is the next step, This is the way to sort of like push my practice, further.
I guess before we jump into Mills directly, what was your experience of touring and everything? Like, how did you come out from that? People always have these romantic notions of touring and everything, but what was your experience?
I mean, it was great in many ways. I met my ex-wife in Portland just before we moved to San Francisco, and the project was with her. And it's the kind of thing that I don't think I ever would have taken it to that level on my own. She was very social, very outgoing. She was embedded in like I guess maybe more post-hardcore kind of indie rock scene in Portland. What I now think of as hipsters, white belts, haircuts. Everyone was like discovering New Order and Gang of Four and all that stuff around 2000 or whatever. And so, that was like a different kind of music scene than I had ever witnessed. Like even going to clubs, I never really had a large social group. I had a few friends. I met a few friends, met a few DJs, met a few producers here and there. I was like, oh my God, you know about this? How do you do things? What's this? What do you have? Like picking each other's brains. But then when I met Marika, I was exposed to this whole DIY culture of people living together and working on projects together and basically, creating culture out of whatever they wanted with no regard for the mainstream or becoming like financially viable in any way. It was just about like what this community could produce. And I guess when we got down to San Francisco, it was kind of like that's where those scenes really were cross-pollinated. There was everything going on at once in a very small city. And so we found ourselves at all kinds of different warehouse parties. I mean, the major flavor of it, as far as what we were involved with, was noise and kind of like, I guess, rock music that was in some way just trying to break open the genre, you know what I mean? But also there was like the IDM and like breakcore and kind of, electronic, aftermath of rave culture, which there was a lot of different strains of in the Bay Area.
There's something about that era where, kind of relating to what you were talking about a little earlier, Greg, how you kind of were drawn to the facelessness of electronic music. The late 90s to like mid-aughts were really like a lot in a lot of these scenes were people trying to like reinsert a kind of face to electronic music.
I think maybe that's an interesting trajectory to look at. For me, I felt like as I left that Portland club scene and then went to San Francisco and experienced this whole other scene, that most of the people I met were not into dance music in that scene at all. Like I remember talking to somebody one night at a bar and they're like, you like house music? Like house music? They just couldn't even believe it. But because they associated it with what it actually looked like in San Francisco was this kind of bougie bottle service, very stiff, very luxurious experience.
And that was very much where house was in the early 2000s. That was definitely like all over the country. That's what house was. You were
or it was like a very like gay and black thing. So
yeah. And I think I've heard from friends that in the 90s San Francisco had a great, and DJs would come up from San Francisco to Portland, but that I didn't see much of that when I first got there. It mostly seemed like why would I go to that place? Drinks are so expensive, the admission's expensive, and who cares? And then
here in New York, in that era, that would have been like in like the early mid-aughts, you'd maybe get dragged out to Cielo for something to see some awesome Detroit DJ, Theo Parrish, whatever. And it's like wow, this $12 beer is gonna really hurt. But
and there were a few times that it poked through. Like I went to see Octave One play live one time. That was amazing. And that was at like a fancy club. I probably didn't buy any drinks, probably snuck some whiskey in or whatever. But by contrast, this other scene of whatever, and that DJs that I knew were actually participating in, they would play at the end of whatever this, random show was or whatever. It was like everyone was kind of ending up at the same places and doing the same things. And this scene felt way more vital, way more anything goes, way more open and possible and social, This was people that would see each other all the time. You'd run into them on the street. You'd establish, it became a music scene in the way that it didn't feel like the dance music scene in San Francisco at that time had much cohesion. So I mean, I was an outsider, so I don't really.
There's a question here for me. How does this link to your earlier experience of music as like something unmediated by the social? Like, was this a kind of like point of kind of connection for you where
yeah, I think I was excited
kind of social
by that.
embeddedness.
It was nice to actually, because growing up I had a very small group of friends, it was like 5 or 6 people, and when we would party it would be just like at somebody's house, turn the music up really loud, drink, that's it, And so this was a whole different thing. It was like, we're going out and seeing, it was a new thing to actually have like friends and acquaintances that you didn't actually have their phone number, might not even know their name, but you still acknowledged them, said hi, and saw them around. And then It did seem like there wasn't such a direct influence of dance music culture on that scene, and so when we sort of brought that in with Eats Tapes, it was kind of an exciting addition to that energy. It was like, oh, at the end of this possibly challenging, loud, difficult show, there's this ecstatic moment of just like dancing and letting it all out. Everybody's drunk, whatever.
I saw you play in Eats Tapes when I was at Bard College, and it must have been like 2002, maybe.
Wow, that's right at the beginning. Yeah.
And I remember being struck. Like the project seemed really interesting to me. I never
Where
never
was
invest. Did you play the Red Room at Bard? Is that right?
If so, it probably would have been more like 2005.
Oh, I saw you play. I couldn't. I mean, I wasn't at Bard in 2005.
Let's see, we played in New York in 2002 ish.
Okay, so maybe I saw you in New York. Where?
It would have been at a house in like, I think somewhere near downtown Brooklyn.
This is gonna drive me nuts now.
I mean,
This is
it's
why we're
quite
doing the
possible.
podcast,
It's
Sean. Get all this shit on record.
Right.
I don't remember touring anywhere outside the West Coast or New York until
like
2005.
Okay, so
or four maybe.
You didn't play Subtonic then, right?
We did actually. Yeah,
Okay,
we played.
So that's
we
it.
played the Bunker actually in Subtonic. That was
That's it.
2006 maybe.
Okay. Okay, interesting. Okay, so my chronology's way off there, but so I must have seen you at the Bunker. It seemed like there was something very interesting about the project that felt like of its time, but also out of its time.
Yeah, it was a mix of influences that were, on my side, I just wanted to make like Jeff Mills techno type stuff, but then I also, had this conception of it as like a train kind of falling off the rails. Like I had unsynchronized like, cassette tape loops that I would make, and like I would do mixer feedback through a delay pedal and freeze that for some squealing unsynchronized loops. And so there was this like techno aspect to it, but then also, it was kind of clattery and noisy. And then I think, from Marika's side, she was injecting more of like a pop influenced and like electro clash influenced like melodic aspect. So it had a mix of like very in the moment, spontaneous fun, but then also this like underlying kind of focused like rhythmic, definitely more techno element. And it was also pretty rare to see people performing live with sequencers and drum machines and this whole synchronized ecosystem. I mean, you'd see drum machines and stuff in other, more live band situations. And as far as electronic music, like laptops were starting to get really big. But, that whole like hardware live on stage was something that we didn't really come across in San Francisco or on tour very much.
Well, maybe let's jump to Mills now, and let's get out of a rich social life and dive really into the nerdy, full control over one myopic process. Well, what brought you? So you knew Seth had been at Mills College. Was that basically? I guess detail me a little bit more about getting to Mills and your work starting there.
Yeah, so he was in his first year there, and I applied and I got in. I didn't really get any financial aid. I think maybe I got, 1 semester of being an assistant in exchange for a discount or whatever. So I was nervous to take the leap, and I wasn't really sure how to evaluate it, like, is this going to be worth it? But at the same time, I was kind of like, well, I know I don't want to be doing home theater installation. And this feels like the next step. And they have this huge lab full of synthesizers, and they have this whole legacy, I didn't
Do you want to just zoom in for a second on what the studio was like at Mills and what synthesizers you had access to?
Sure. They had the first Buchla 100 there, which is crazy. I looked behind it one point, and some of the modules were just point-to-point components just hanging. And they had, let's see, an ARP 2600. They had a Moog. I can't remember which Moog, which model it was. I actually didn't gel too much with that because at that time I was kind of obsessed with frequency modulation and also with like extreme depths. At that point I thought every parameter should go as far as it possibly can, And it wasn't until later that I realized, oh, you're sacrificing resolution when you do that, So I got to the Moog and I tried doing some FM and I was like, that's not that deep. Okay, maybe I don't have much use for this. But they had a synthesizers.com system there that had been donated. That's maybe the thing I used the most there just because it had the most functionally flexible modules in it. let's see what else. They had a studio that I didn't use too much outside of a recording class where we recorded on 24-track tape through, I can't remember what console. And it was fun for that class, but I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I mean, essentially, there was a point where I realized I could have spent this much money on more gear than I'm actually getting to use here.
Speaking of the synthesizers.com 5U modular, I wanted to ask about a piece, and you detail this on your fantastic website. I have to give you props for having a great website that's has a lot of good resources. But so you used the 5U modular to model the logistic equation. I wanted to bring this up. I took a lot of nonlinear dynamics classes when I was a physics major, and I remember being fascinated by the logistic equation, which is a very simple equation to model population growth, but it's kind of one of the first things you learn in classes on nonlinear dynamics and chaos, because the logistic map is this way of modeling chaotic systems and really beginning to understand how they work, which is to say that you'll have this system and you change the inputs ever so slightly, and all of a sudden the system will react in completely different ways. And these you use it to build these bifurcation maps. You have a great image of the bifurcation map in this section of your site, which is basically that, you'll have the system, and as you change X in this system, things, the output changes as you would expect. It grows in a sort of linear way. And then at some point, you'll change X ever so slightly, and the system will start oscillating between two totally different outputs, and then it'll kind of break up even more, and then you'll basically just get noise for a region. And then most interestingly, you just keep increasing X, and you're getting these different results. And then at some point, the system is complete noise, and then you increase X a little bit more, and it'll snap into some very consistent value. So this is kind of the basics of chaos. And obviously in your work, this kind of interest in chaos, nonlinear dynamics and things like that has become, something you're very interested in, something I'm very interested in. How did you encounter the logistic map, this kind of little mathematical curiosity? And what brought you to the idea of replicating it on a synthesizer, and how did you plan to go about it?
Well, I think it was two things, actually. One was, so I first saw that equation in the book Chaos by James Gleick.
Yeah,
and
classic.
Which I guess I must have been reading right around the time that I started at Mills. But
and good to mention that book is not super technically heavy. So if people are interested in that, it's a great introduction to like how chaos actually works, because it's a really like it's a read that's not super technically overbearing.
Yeah. In fact, I think I actually came to that book in a roundabout way. I think I read 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History by Manuel de Landa before that a friend passed me. And that was sort of like this philosophical application of nonlinear dynamics to historical processes. And that was just blowing my mind. So seeing
Sounds
that...
like I need to pick that up. That sounds cool.
After that, I wanted to understand more about chaos and about nonlinear dynamics on a basic level, from outside of this kind of... he's a clear writer, I think, but it is very much like experimental thought, you know what I mean? So I was reading that book, and at the same time, I was on the Analog Heaven email list, and this whole controversy started brewing when I think it was there's a whole just way people talk about synthesizers where it's like, oh, this one sounds this way, or how's this? And it can get very vague. And there was this moment where Ezra Buchla got very irritated with people talking that way and said, I can't remember what Buchla module he was talking about. He was working at Buchla at that time, and he was saying, it does this. And he had the equation of what the module does. And he's like, that is more informative than any description of how it sounds. And that was kind of a revelation to me, that you could describe the functionality of the module mathematically. And so as I thought about that and thought, oh, you could actually do math on synthesizers, I thought you could take this chaos equation, which looks like a fairly simple equation relatively, and try to execute it on a synthesizer and see what that sounds like. So that, I think, was the seed of the idea. And I was over my head trying to do that. I got onto the synth and I was like, okay, what am I going to use to represent the numbers?
Right.
And then eventually I was like, oh, the volts. The volts are the numbers. 1 volt is 1, 2 volts is 2. Great. So it was just this, like, sitting in that lab at Mills and like trying to think through that was like a very I could feel my understanding growing as that was happening, you know what I mean? And I wasn't sure if I was actually going to be, to me this seemed like an almost impossible task to try to achieve this, to take this exposure to math and then, you know, this other crazy equation, which who knows what it does or what it could sound like, and think that it actually could be done on a synth. So I it's a feeling that I actually often have working with electronics where I'm like, I don't deserve to feel like I'm confident enough that I can actually achieve this, that this is actually going to work. Like this could be a complete waste of time, but consistently just keeping my head down and working through it and just carefully going through and trying to find out where I've made a mistake or where I'm wrong has given me great results, you know? So as I sat there in that lab and just sort of beat my head against it, for several days it wasn't working and I couldn't figure out why until I saw that the multipliers that I think I had to build the multiplier module because there wasn't enough. I was going to use ring modulators in the modular, and I think it only had 2 maybe, and I needed 4. So I basically built a cardboard panel with 4 8633 multipliers in it. But after a few days of trying to figure out, I'm adjusting it, this is going here, this voltage is correct, I'm reading it with a multimeter, this should be happening. Eventually I saw that in the data sheet for the multiplier chip, it divides the result by 10 to keep the signal in the same range as the output. So
now you've got to add that in.
Yep. I made some amplifiers and then it worked. And I was amazed. I think in retrospect, I don't really like that patch that much. I think that you could come up with a much more direct patch with that equation. I used it to create like a frequency modulation patch basically that would change the timbre, but it's exponential FM, so it also changes the pitch. So it's more complex than it needs to be to express the character of the equation, basically.
Right. What's interesting, of course, is like while you're doing this, is like you're trying to solve a technical problem. But in one way, you could put on your scientist hat and say, I'm trying to solve this problem. I'm trying to plot data and get an answer and solve, in this case, for something like the logistic equation, like a physical system, and use the synthesizer like an analog computer, but you're an artist. So what going through your mind, you're trying this out, when things don't work, is that still interesting? What's coming out, and how is that tickling your brain as an artist as you're working through these things? And are you seeing things where, you have this technical idea driving this explorative path, but throughout that, as you're going through that path, you're saying, yeah, well, fuck it, I don't really care if this thing works or not on a scientific level. I just like what it sounds, how it sounds, and I want to actually explore this, branch off and explore this little direction.
It's a good question. I think that my tendency is actually to rein that in and try to see it through. You know what I mean? And I think part of it, 2 things. I think part of it is that the idea of doing math on a synthesizer is an example of breaking the rules in that way that always really appealed to me. I guess these impulses exist within a context in relation to other people and their impulses and their artistic output. And I think there's always been this kind of oppositional desire to sort of I'm going to be doing something that's different than what somebody else is doing, and pushing through and executing this thing on a synthesizer is more important to me than, oh, I like this sound, I'm going to go in this direction now. I think as an artist, I think that there's a drive. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example where I've maybe abandoned that initial impulse. It's usually because I find some reason that it's not technically valid, and therefore I find that I decide that it's not artistically valid.
So what you're saying is that for you, sort of aesthetic preferences, taste is subordinate to kind of process.
Not totally. I mean, I think that
there's nothing wrong with that. There's no judgment on my that.
Yeah. I don't think so, because my favorite works are both. You know what I mean?
Right.
I am sitting in a room, which I heard, actually I was going to a graphic design school in Portland that was one of those for-profit schools, but by some, stroke of good luck, the digital audio teacher had this art background and he showed us that piece, and I was floored, and the fact that the process and the sound of it are both exciting, that's my favorite,
Yeah.
And so I think
I am sitting in a room is a particularly good example, because the aesthetic product is really really, it's a flowering of and perfect illustration of the technical process.
Yeah, it's so tight. And so I think when I like with that equation, the fact that it does snap back into these stable states and then transitions back into chaos, listening to that to me is like there's bang for the buck in just the sound of it as well, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And like I'm less interested in process for its own sake if there isn't some kind of payoff like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I'm sure I've abandoned projects where I think that the technical idea is going to pay off and then I don't find that. I'm just struggling to come up with an example.
What then led you to the Surge? Because I mean, you're basically using the synth, the 5U modular at Mills College to do this kind of analog computing task. And, you know, the Surge is kind of this, of all the synthesizers, the most kind of, that lends itself to those kinds of analog computing things. So is that what brought you to it? I mean, you had seen the Surge previously, but, you know, you've now kind of built your own and gone in that direction. But what kind of kept you coming back to the Surge?
Well, let's see. At one point, Eats Tapes did a residency in Rotterdam at Worm that was basically 5 days in this incredible studio where they had a VCS3 and an ARP 2500 and a huge rack of Surge stuff. I think maybe there was like 4 panels of Surge and then some homemade things in there, but they had the Wilson analog delay in there. And we ended up doing a performance just on that rack, basically sequencing a bunch of stuff and then wheeling it out into the performance space. And just, I have a recording I still need to mix from that. But so that was 2008 maybe. And so it was like a reintroduction to Surge. And I was like, yes, this is my favorite instrument, basically. But it was always out of reach. I just thought it was too expensive, you know. And then when Eurorack came around.
For a long time.
Yeah. When Eurorack came around, I was exposed to a little bit in San Francisco. There was a store called Robot Speak that had Dope for modules and some of the other stuff that had started to come out. But even that I thought of as too expensive compared to the gear I was buying at the time. And I also kept trying to patch things that I couldn't stack. And I was frustrated, you know? And so I never really got too crazy into Eurorack. Control opened and I would go in there occasionally, and I bought a few things. At one point, I think I had maybe like 3 rows of Eurorack stuff. And then I saw your video series on cybernetics with the Surge, and I was like, oh, I have to. There's no question. I have to get back into this.
Yeah, they should pay me.
Illustrious brand ambassador.
Yeah, exactly.
I just had someone get a hold of me and say, hey, I've been inspired by your Surge stuff. And I was like, said, if you haven't checked out this video, you have to check it. This series, you have to check it out. And he's like, oh, yeah, that's what got me into Surge.
Well, we try to spread the gospel here. But so you built, for your system, you also have built some like specific digital modules.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about those? And also like when people talk about hardware analog synthesizers, they're always like, oh, but the nice thing about Surge is the like kind of analog computer-ness of it, the kind of boiling down to these very, very simple, very, very basic building blocks. And then some of those digital, this switching between digital and analog, this switching between like continuous and discrete time, this kind of playing in this kind of sandbox that allows you to, and because chaos often requires this kind of like switch from digital to analog and back again. Yeah, can you just tell me like a little bit about those specific digital modules that you built, what you kind of, your goal is for this instrument that has become, it seems to me kind of your main instrument.
Yeah, I'd say it is at this point. I don't know, I guess I had always been aware of and sort of keeping track of what was going on Ken Stone's site and kind of like, oh, well, it's too much work to develop the infrastructure to actually take advantage of any of this, but it's really cool designs, interesting stuff, just reading the descriptions. And he had some low-level digital stuff on there. He had like, I think some modules that used Schmidt trigger chips to generate square waves and things, comparators. And there was a page by this guy, Joe Paradiso, where he had all of these things. He had like hacked little digital keyboards to integrate with his modular and all this stuff. So I think I was always like curious about what could be done with like very primitive digital circuitry. They're also at Mills. I had Chaabishaav as a teacher who was part of the Hub and the League of Automatic Music Composers. Basically, early computer networking and interactive computer music with, screenless computer kits, basically switches and just bits. And so I guess I'd always been curious to mess around with that kind of stuff. And then there's certain stuff that I just wanted in the modular, like a shift register, So there's a lot of those chips. It's very easy to design a module around. Just look at the data sheet, see what the interfacing needs to be, and then adapt it to surge standards, and there you go. And then I think what really took it into the sort of the fully digital realm was Doc Sketchy on ModWiggler posted a design for a quantizer that wasn't based on a microcontroller. It's not clocked in any way. It's basically just a series of comparators to do real-time voltage quantization at 128 steps. And so I was like, wow, I can build this right now. I took it apart and built it into a separate analog to digital converter and then digital to analog converter. But basically, if you plug an analog signal into it and take an analog signal out of the DAC, you get a quantizer. So,
is it quantized to musical semitones or?
Yeah, the 128 steps are apart by semitones. So okay. you take out the last bit, the least significant bit, and you get whole steps. And then you take out more and more cables and you get bigger jumps. So then once I had that, I had the input and the output to a fully digital system. So then I quickly realized that to do anything like a digital bit reducer or sample rate reducer, I needed a latch. So then I started looking around. I found a latch circuit that could take a clock and would hold the bits until the next clock pulse came. So then I built that. And then, I have a few other just basic things that are primarily based around just basic logic chips that can be sort of inserted into the pathway. I don't know that I have a real plan for how to use that stuff other than just I can now experiment with it. And Surge is the perfect place to do it because, like you said, everything else is so low level and you could easily just take bits from anywhere and just start using them in different ways. And I've also added comparators to all the digital inputs so that you can take signals from anywhere in the synth, and as soon as they cross a threshold, which I think is a little over 1 volt, you can use those as bits in the digital system as well. And I did quickly realize that to do anything serious fully digital, it's tons and tons of cables, it's the ADC and DAC are 7 bits each, so there's 7 cables. They have to go into a module that has another 7 inputs and 7 outputs.
At that point, you're spending more on cables than building the modules themselves.
Yeah, exactly. But I had always wanted some kind of voltage quantizer anyway, just to try to do stair-steppy things that weren't clocked. Yeah. And so I think that Doc Sketchy design was sort of what kicked it off.
We also want to talk a bit about your visual work. How much of this plays into your visual work, and how much of it how do you see the bridge between, especially the kinds of things you're interested in now on the audio side? How do you bridge those with your visual work?
Well, I think that the connection is really just the curiosity about systems and about how to play with systems in real time, that just applies to both. So I think when I was at San Francisco City College, I took a video editing class, which at that point was basically shot on Super VHS and then edited by proxy on the computer in little 240 by 120 digitizations. And then there was this whole automated rack that would take your edit and it would apply it to the Super VHS tape. So I think actually we were transferring Super VHS to beta, and then it would actually cut the edit on the beta, which was another fascinating, whole technological infrastructure that I didn't even get into until later. But when I first did a project in that class, I did video feedback just on a TV at home, and I was hours and hours just changing the settings, turning the camera around, doing all this stuff.
Endless fun.
Yeah.
Endless fun.
At that point, in the early 2000s, having already been experimenting with audio feedback and stuff like that, I was like, oh, there's an obvious corollary here just in terms of seeing how the system behaves and, seeing what happens when you insert things and all that. And so, and then also at San Francisco State, a few years later, I started buying cheap gear little security cameras, and I bought a Panasonic MX-10 mixer. And one of the projects I did at school was to add control voltage inputs. And I'm trying to remember, I didn't even really have anything to use it with at that time. I had a friend who was really into video, mostly digital video, Nate Boyce. And actually, part of my inspiration came from my ex-wife and Nate were at San Francisco Art Institute together, and they had a club they basically had some small budget from the school to rent films from Video Data Bank and from all these institutions, and they would show experimental video and structural film and stuff like that. And so I saw a lot of stuff that way too. Tony Conrad's The Flicker was hugely inspirational to me. So I guess I saw an easy, the experimenting in both realms was natural to me because I was interested in ideas that applied, I think, in both media. But with those CV inputs, Nate got a hold of an oscillator from someone. So we had something that we could strobe the video mixer with. And then I'm trying to remember what else I used for that. I did have the MIDI to CV converter from the failed Paya. So I think I was sequencing some of the parameters of the video mixer with that. Oh, and then at Mills, I did a piece that used a Nord micromodular where I bypassed the capacitors in the audio outputs so that I could get CV out of it. And I basically used the Nord to modulate the video mixer while it was in a feedback loop with I think it was maybe just a line feedback loop. But anyway, I kind of started getting interested in video synthesizers. There was a page called audiovisualizers.net, which if it's not still up, I'm sure is on the Internet Archive, but that sort of had a list of all of the historic video synthesizers that never made it into commercial production but had been used in studios and by artists here and there. And so I kind of, I once LZX came out with Eurorack, I did start buying some video Eurorack modules. I think working with video, it's because you have that third dimension. You don't just have a single line with a waveform. You also have the height of the frame to deal with. It's not quite as direct or as elegant as working with sound, and it's much harder, I think, to find at least abstract things that are as exciting. You know, I guess it is pretty fun to mess with pre-existing imagery and to use cameras and stuff like that. I did get into digital video gear and trying to work together like automation of an entire, like get everything that I'd do with music completely synchronized to video hardware, which do not develop a video hardware habit. I mean, I have these two things right here that are basically like 50 pounds each and worthless that I spent too much money on eBay, you know, and can't get rid of them. And it's like, all that stuff can be done so easily with software now. But I do have some exciting things also that I got out of this obsession with. For years, I was trying to get this thing called the Devious, Digital Video Effects, and then they just, named it Devious. It was made by Abacus. Used on like Super Bowl graphics, like fake 3D effects, fake lighting, and like just twisting the frame around in all these different ways. It's basically like After Effects, proto After Effects in a real-time box, that has a control panel and you can keyframe it so you can sequence everything out. And so you can do immediate feedback. There's one frame of delay through the whole box. And so where did I get, I must have got it on eBay. I got the standard definition version of it, which was like, it's like the size of 2 microwaves, basically. It's like 5 or 6 U and like 3 times as deep, and it uses like 750 watts. You turn it on and the fans just run at full speed. But I eventually got the HD version of it that I had been chasing on eBay for years, periodically putting in offers. It was listed at like $3,000 or something like that, and I kept just offering like $700, see what happens. Ignored, and finally it went down to like $1,500. I offered $750, and then he countered with $900, and I got it. So wow, that was a few years ago.
Persistence.
Yeah, but
keep at it, and
it's incredible. Happen. I mean, just because of the fact that and those things are all changing now, but the fact that you could do basically real-time stuff through it and automate all of it and have several video feeds going in and out of it was just like amazing. Like I don't have particular videos that I want to make. It's inspired by what the gear can do, So yeah, I mean the through line with between your audio and visual works is really a kind of like a orientation around process and kind of a feedback being the other kind of linking theme. Is there anything else there that like unites those practices for you? I think being able to automate things is always, part of it too, because I've never, like when I try, I've bought some Moroccan instruments in the past few years. Selwa's Moroccan. We go there once a year, twice a year. And occasionally I'll try to play an instrument, and I just can't even imagine, the persistence and the just like being able to maintain the same pattern with your hands over and over. It's like it's actually a skill I'd like to develop, because I think having a relationship to a musical instrument that's much more physical and intimate would be what most people think of as like the benefits of music. It might be relaxing and meditative, whereas I sit down to do something and I'm like, okay, what about this? Okay, what if I do this and this and this? What if I unplug this from here? It's constantly a...
I mean, I guess, yeah, the question of where the body lies when one is interacting with an electronic instrument it raises a different set of questions than
usually hunched. Usually sometimes posture's not great.
That said, like in those early days when I finally did discover like looping drum machines and using analog drum modules and actually starting to think, oh, this music can be done live, like that was extremely exciting. And that's actually the most fun way to do it, is to have instant access to every parameter, and actually to even reduce those parameters that you're using to a set that's easily manageable. I mean, I do have a lot of fun designing live sets. I went through a phase where I was just like, okay, what's the smallest live set I can design?
I remember you talking about that at some point.
Like I even...
What'd you settle on?
Well, for that, I think at a certain point I had a DX200 and a Boss SP303 and a Electrics EQ Killer. And that's basically, a 3-band isolator, but it has an effects loop in it. So if you kill a band, you can bring that back in through the effects. So I basically had the DX200 and the Boss. I think the Boss was plugged in through the effects loop. So if I wanted to play samples off the Boss, I just had to kill the bands or kill a band. And then I would also do things like just run reverb through the center band and play with the cutoff frequencies. Cool. And it was tricky because I didn't have anything else that was rhythmically synced that I could sort of like mix to. And eventually I ended up doing the same thing with a LXR drum machine and the DX200 and a little reverb pedal and the EQ Killer. But just having those tiny little things, and then in preparing, being forced to try to produce things in a certain way so that it will work. I ended up playing through a micro limiter too for those sets to get things a little bit louder, but like the DX200 has a notch filter. Like the filter can be used as a notch filter, so I would start cutting out bass frequencies where the kick was, cut them out of the bass and everything, and just really try to get the sounds to be as prepared as I could to allow me to do the manipulation that I wanted to do live and still have some freedom, But this is another one of those sort of like contrary... It's an expression of that contrary attitude where like, well, everyone's going to bring out their giant modular and their 909 and everything else, and I'm going to bring out these little groove boxes.
I bring it up because, like, in the academy, so to speak, I sometimes have encountered sort of dismissals of electronic music practices as not embodied, and thus kind of like not really counting as performance practices, or maybe even counting as music on a certain level. And that's sort of, I think, on one hand, kind of flatly disproven just by what you were talking about, right? As an electronic performer, one steps into the role of sort of systems designer, instrument designer. The lines between performance and composition and design all get very blurry. And that's all really interesting, but like really important to explore kind of at this juncture of humans, kind of humanity's further imbrication of kind of organic and inorganic unfolds.
Well, in a certain way, I think as a listener, my experience of music has always been disembodied from people creating it. Like, as I was talking about earlier with the radio, just hearing songs back to back and not having any names to attach to it or something like that. But also, like, I remember as a little kid hearing my parents' records, like Muddy Waters or whatever, that my ear couldn't distinguish between drums and guitar or anything like that. And I had no visual imagination of a person making those sounds. I just heard this like amalgamation of noises together that, I was really captivating, but there wasn't any, I wasn't wondering where the body was or anything like that. Aside from like the voice, I could hear the voice,
Totally. But like the flip side is like what you just said about kind of like more embodied, and I want to kind of heavily scare quote that, but more embodied practices with like a physical instrument that you're acoustically sounding. There's something really great and beautiful about that. You can achieve certain kind of certain meditative states that are different than one encounters as an electronic performer, I guess. So.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to jump off that because to synthesize those two things, I wanted to ask about your latest release, Chaabishaav. Can you just talk a bit about it? You use a Moroccan rhythm. And also, is the name, sounds like Chaabishaav. Is there a relationship there?
It's a weak pun because there isn't anything about Chaabishaav in it, but the rhythm is called Chabi, which is Chaabi.
Okay.
But
weak puns are the best puns.
And this is the only podcast that's going to pick up on that, I guarantee you.
But that rhythm is something that we went to a couple weddings in Morocco, and I'm sure I had heard it in cafes and stuff like that too. But there was this rhythm that the bands would be playing, and I would see everyone there. I'd hear it, and to me it sounded like you just chopped off the last two beats of like a 4/4 pattern, but then everyone there is clapping in a place that makes no sense to me, and they all get it. And I was just like, what is going on here? How is this the beat? And like, so basically what I have as the kick and the snare, which are usually like some higher and lower drum, are not on the beat. They don't establish where the one is or anything like that. It's basically a 6/8 rhythm. It's like 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, but then that kick and snare are not anywhere in that where you would think they are. They're like, I think it goes da-doom, where that first, where I hear the one is actually like the second eighth note, or the second pulse, second step after the one. But
you have no idea where everyone else is hearing the one.
Yeah, I mean, I have gotten it. Selwa has shown me and explained it to me, and I've understood where it actually is. But it's like the clap is like, it's just that those big beats that you hear aren't on those at all. They're like in the middle, something like that. And I don't have it in my memory still, but there is a YouTube video where someone explains actually how it's all sequenced out. So you can discover what it actually is, but I still hear it, and I just automatically hear it where the pulse would be in a Western rhythm.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe you did this as well at Mills. I did a little bit of time in the gamelan at Wesleyan. And the gamelan, the accent is on the last beat rather than the first beat. The gong is always on the last beat. And it creates a totally different feel that feels very wrong from a Western perspective.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's hard to remember how that felt at this point. I guess that was 13, 12 years ago or something like that. But the only way I could learn those rhythms was like brute force memory. Like, okay, this happens, then this happens, then this happens.
But if you keep playing it, at some point it will get in your body.
There's one other thing about that liveness is that's actually always been a approach I've taken in production. That's why I've gone through, phases of using software. I got deep into Reactor at one point, basically because I was like so frustrated with what I couldn't do with hardware. I was like, oh, okay, let me jump in here. I can do whatever I can think of. But at this point, even in the recording and mixing phase, I still want to have my hands on every piece of it. I want to make decisions that are intuitive and be able to just reach out and grab something. And it's kept me away from using computers to the extent that I have a hardware 24-track recorder in here. And everything I still mostly only do stereo mixes, but when I record multi-track and I mix down, I want everything to be available and accessible all at once, because I feel like that is still part of the creative process for me. Like, making those decisions isn't like a second step of like, okay, let's make it listenable now. It's right. Like it is part of, like, those are compositional decisions that I'm making in the mix. So I need everything to be immediate and like, accessible by my body. I just like, when it's hidden behind layers of windows, it's a completely different experience for me.
Let's linger for a bit on the kind of like kind of broader meditative themes of the podcast. How do you make your practice work, Greg? As how do you exist as an artist under capitalism?
Well, I guess I think that the short answer is I don't. You know, I like that
Damn.
website is basically all I have. I took a web design class, not web design. It was like, I think the class was about JavaScript, and I think that's where it ended up. I got completely lost. Like I learned some basic HTML in the class, but then when we got into databases, I was like, where are they? What? I can't see anything that's happening. And I never went that far in math. I think partly due to just the teachers I had in school. And so, you know, I feel like math is an essential part of my work now, but it is in a kind of naive and curious and exploratory way. But to go back to like the broader context, I feel very fortunate to have been able to be a part of the New York music scene over the past several years. There's always so many people doing so many cool things here, and occasionally, you know, people have reached out and pulled me in to do some very cool stuff and put out records and perform at various festivals and clubs. But at the same time, scenes have always felt very ephemeral to me and hard to maintain kind of like a stable presence in. I guess what I was getting at is that having learned enough skill to actually just put up a basic web page, I was like, okay, at least I can organize things to the degree that if somebody wants to find it and wants to look at it, it's there for them. And I have to give Selwa some credit too, because up until 2017, my music was just never anywhere either. And she was like, just put it on Bandcamp, just put the music out there, put it up there. And I was like, okay.
Selwa is so profoundly good at that stuff. We will definitely have her on again in this new incarnation of the podcast. But yeah, just wanted to say she is like, she managed to do that in a profoundly like organized and impressive way from my perspective.
It's true, and not to speak for her, but even she doesn't really know where or how to exist in this context. You know.
I guess, like, Greg, like you're kind of like, I guess what you're saying is your professional practice and kind of creative practices you see as wholly discrete.
You mean like jobs?
Yeah, like how you make a living, how you socially reproduce yourself.
Well, I'm a video engineer. When I moved to New York, Matthew Curry actually hooked me up with AV work, and so I just became like an audio tech, and then gradually learned some about video, and just went further and further with that. And in a certain way, I was like blown away. I was like, oh, I can work for day rates. I can work a few days a month and make enough to pay my rent. Like, this is incredible. And also I was like, oh, I'm basically building a studio, operating it and tearing it down. This is what I should be doing for work. But the other side of it is that it's private equity conferences or cryptocurrency conferences or whatever. So it's like, I'm privileged to be able to actually care about to be dissatisfied with the final product. You know, I enjoy the work itself, and I enjoy the people I get to work with. But it is pretty binary in general in terms of having to basically switch back and forth between working in the studio when I have free time and then having to take work when it comes along and be busy for periods of time and have to just put aside whatever else I'm working on. So it does take away from time that I would otherwise be spending on creative pursuits.
I guess so. So what I'm hearing is you find both your kind of professional and artistic practices rewarding, but you do find it hard to switch between them.
Yeah, I mean, I can't complain about it, you know, because like as far as jobs go, it's definitely the best job I've ever had. You know, I have some degree of autonomy, and I'm not really that interested in, you know, trying to work within the art or music world as a profession. I did work at Output for a few years as a sound engineer, but in terms of like trying to fit my own practice within these industries, it's difficult to see a way to really make it work. I guess I enjoy the autonomy and freedom that I have working in isolation, and I've never felt comfortable or compelled to do the things that seem necessary to try to make it into a career.
So your kind of creative and professional sides do utilize certain shared skill sets. Is there anything you want to say regarding that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I get to use a lot of the same kinds of thinking in terms of trying to exploit the behavior of a system in ways that might not be obvious. And I think kind of training myself to think in that way has actually made me better at this discipline, and vice versa. I mean, a lot of like just standards from the, you know, professional audio and video world have made their way into my practice and tightened up certain technical aspects and given me new ideas to try.
What's the worst client you ever had? What's the most punishing crypto conference you did? Bibi Netanyahu's birthday party was a step too far.